10 or 20 years ago. It was about a name. It was a single name or one syllable. It was Apple or Sonos or these types, those types of words, Supreme, were these big sort of brands that came out, and it was all based on the brand. But now we've gotten to a place where it's really based on the backstory.
Hey guys, welcome to Wine, Whiskey and Weed Show. This is your host, Sid Patel. I'm the CEO of Beverage Trade Network, and today my guest is David Paleschuck. David is an author of a book called Branding Bird. He also has worked in many companies like American Express, MasterCard, PepsiCo, Microsoft, and these are just a few which I know. David, I think I'll have you have your proper introduction done, but you're an expert in branding. And what I really wanted to talk about is how cannabis brands can get their branding right today with you. So David, over to you. Why don't you just give us a little context story about, how you entered into cannabis, and before that, about your corporate career, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, years ago, I studied product design and industrial design at Parsons School of Design. So I've always been interested in the development of products, and really in the development of products, you start off with what the problem is and who your customer is. So whether it was at MasterCard or Microsoft or Pepsi, it was always about focusing on the customer. And that's one thing that I think the cannabis industry seems to miss a little bit. We create brands here without really thinking about who we're creating brands for. Not too long ago, people said, to me in particular, hey, who needs cannabis branding? Cannabis sells itself, and the truth is that that might have been the case, years ago, but it's not the case anymore. So, with all the different form factors that are in play, and all of the different cannabinoids that are now benefit specific, it's really important to start off with who your customer is, who your consumer is, as the first starting point. From there, you start to look at what their lifestyle is and what their demographic is. And really, you get into their need states and rituals, right? So if you know that somebody consumes cannabis right before they go to sleep, to put them to bed, first in the morning, to inspire them, whatever it is, there's just different, different needs and different need states and different rituals that people consume their cannabis products.
Got it. So if there was a cannabis, like a brand questionnaire, right? Like, let's say, I'm sure you as a professional would ask any entrepreneur that, hey, here's 10 questions first answer for me to get an understanding of what you're trying to do, right? Like to understand your customer and so on. What kind of brand, questions you would ask, first to understand who your consumer is?
Well, the funny thing is I'm working on a rebranding project right now. And the logo of this company is very strong, very masculine. And my first question was, who are you actually selling to? Because they're a B2B company, and they support the industry. And so I had asked them, and the answer was they weren't really sure who they were selling to. Purchasing managers was the answer. And I said, who are your purchasing managers? You have a list. Let's go take a look. And we looked. And to our surprise, 65% of the people that bought their products on an ongoing basis, on a recurring basis, were women. So, it just behooves them to really understand who they're selling to and maybe how to appeal to their customers.
Great. So that brings me to a follow-up question, which I was just making a note on. I wanted to understand, let's throw in 4 or 5 different profiles. Just throw in like quick 30 seconds on this is how a good brand would relate to for this kind of consumer, right? So let's say first is, I think woman consumer who's 35 to 45. What's your advice on using the colors, the branding, the tone? What kind of branding work for that?
Well, excuse me, there's definitely the psychology of color.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about that in my book a lot, where, blue and green are the most prevalent colors and the most liked colors by males and females.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. But again, it comes back down to, you said women in their, 30s to 40s.
Mm-hmm.
Those are typically younger women who might have kids. They, a stereotype here could be a soccer mom. They're busy with their kids, they're busy with the job. They have to consume discreetly, which then leads into form factors. It might be a tincture or a mint or so by better knowing who that consumer is and that persona, you can actually speak to them and really provide a solution to their problem. At the end of the day, if they can't smoke in front of their kids or smell like cannabis, then selling them a pre-roll isn't going to solve their issue.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Good point. What about men consumer? What's different there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the difference with men and women, just from a gender perspective, men typically consume more, but men are more open about their willingness or desire to get high, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas women are more focused on relieving stress or anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So, even in that different approach, if you will, it's important, you can leverage that into products.
Understood.
An example that I often give here is, I talk about additive and subtractive. So if someone is in an additive state of mind when they're using cannabis, they're looking for inspiration, they're looking for focus. Maybe they'll consume before a hike or before going skateboarding or before doing yoga or something like that. Whereas in a subtractive state, it's more like taking Advil or Tylenol. You have a headache, you have a back pain, you want to go to sleep. It's more about alleviating something, and that mind state is very different. So depending on how you're coming to cannabis and what you're looking from it, that also has everything to do about how you market it and how you meet that consumer where they are in that particular moment.
Got it. So, if I had to sum it up, it's the consumer. And more importantly is what is the utility of that consumption, right? Am I taking for sleep? Am I taking for getting focus or doing a party, but want to be high? So what is the focus? And then you sort of relate to that in your packaging and come up with maybe a name as well, right? To start with.
Yep. I look at it as 4 pillars to building a meaningful brand. So the first thing is the consumer. The second thing that comes out of that is their lifestyle and their need states, right? So that leads to, can I consume discreetly or can I consume indiscreetly? If they're going to just consume discreetly, then they need a mint or a sublingual slip or a patch or an edible. If they consume indiscreetly, then they're going to light up a pre-roll or a blunt or a bong or something like that. So once you start to know what their lifestyle is and how they consume, then you can supply them with a product that's right for their consumption. But then on top of that, then you overlay that with what I call the brand archetypes, which is really the packaging. That's where you get down to the fonts and the colors and the type of packaging. Is it recyclable or not? That's where all the bells and whistles go off to really speak to the consumer and hook them in once you have figured out their problem. Now that's the icing on the cake, if you will, when you get to that.
Got it. So I'm trying to relate this with, some of my personal experiences, let's say on alcohol bev, right? We are launching our own gin brand as well. And the idea was to really first define what this brand is about. Naming was a little bit later. So it was just defining about what you want to do, right? And then what do you want brand to do and so on. So is that a right approach? And then you come up with the name in the limited, that is this name doing that? And then you keep on looking for names which actually fits into that category. Let's say my brand was, quokka, which is the world's happiest animal. So idea was to play around with happiness, right? And sell happiness and promote happiness and so on. So we did not go the name route, which I normally took when I was in wine business, which is just pure name and then come up with whatever nice packaging with that catchy name. So what's the theory? You have so much experience in coming up with a name or a philosophy or a concept. What do you suggest on where to start? What is the right way to come up with a perfect end-to-end sort of thing?
Well, it's funny that the answer to that has changed over time, right? I think a few years ago, not too long ago, it was really about the name. Maybe 10 or 20 years ago, it was about a name. It was a single name or one syllable. It was Apple or Sonos or these types, those types of words, Supreme, or these big sort of brands that came out, and it was all based on the brand. But now we've gotten to a place where it's really based on the backstory, and then the graphic or the imagery sort of comes later. It's really
like what does the brand stand for, sort of things.
Yes. Yes. And if you really look at the evolution of branding over the last couple of decades, not too long ago. So if you think about, let's go to the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s were really about efficiency. So, that's when industrial, that was post-war, industrial things were taking place, modernization, modern America was taking place.
You basically, I get your point. You're looking at what is a mass scale as well. A functionality of the production as well is a part of a brand, right? Like Pepsi can, design of that can is important because of the production challenges.
Right. But in the 50s and 60s, or let's say 50s through 70s, it was more about efficiency. So if you were selling a car, it was miles per gallon, right?
Understood.
And then once you got to maybe the 70s and 80s, you'd sell that car in a different way. It was more like the wind blowing through your hair as you drove the car. It was more about how the car made you feel more than it was about the efficiency. And then when we got into like the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, it was really about how did that car differentiate you in society's hierarchy? An expensive car, where does that put you? And then finally, we're now at this place where it's really what you believe. So now people drive Teslas, of course, for the hierarchical, the notoriety and sort of the label, but they're also buying into the electric, vehicle, the future, moving away from gas and petroleum. And that's, and if you even think about Whole Foods and how Whole Foods started, it was people that were foodies that were coming in and saying, hey, I don't want to buy this anymore. I really want healthier food. This is what I believe. It's better for the environment. It's better for me, those types of things. And so, over the course of time, the answer to your question has changed. So to answer your question now is, you're better off looking for that backstory. You're better off looking for the meaning behind the brand, the promise behind the brand. So people buy into your story, and then you continuously and consistently fulfill that promise that you've created.
So what is a good brand to you? Where you think that, okay, I think this has a potential. Okay, I don't want an answer based on Apple or Nike here. It is something where absolutely it's day one, and you know that this has hit a home run for branding.
Oh boy, God, I don't know. Like nothing is
just something, sometimes you see and oh wow, that is a good package overall.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is probably going to be obvious, maybe less obvious than Nike or Apple. But I think, on the smaller level, Cann has done a really great job. I think they've done a great job because they picked their market. I guess it's funny, when they first came into the market, they weren't an LGBTQIA+ brand. They were a cannabis-infused beverage. And I want to say it was June 2020, in that month where the company all of a sudden really started to promote their association with the gay community. And then now today, people really know Cann as, of course, a cannabis-infused beverage, but with a real tie-in to the LGBTQIA+ community. And so, and that's not only because of the owners, but it's because Ellen DeGeneres and Gwyneth Paltrow and Rosario Dawson and a whole bunch of others have invested. So I think what's cool about them is they're in it for the long haul. They're investing heavily to create their brand awareness within specific communities. Whereas many of the other, at least in this case, cannabis infused beverages are trying to appeal to everybody. They're trying to be, they're
So
trying to.
I get it. I have a contradiction there. Sometimes it's so hard to be disciplined to play with the brand book. Like, okay, these are the brand tones, these are the brand guidelines. This is what you can post on social media. This is what you can't. Because ultimately, it's that if you play the game in that parameter, the brand image comes out eventually, right? It's much clearer. But then for young and startups, if they don't get a sale, they're just going to say, hey, buy today, here's a discount. Or something happens and you start deviating, right? So it's very hard. Can is a different example because they were backed up with a lot of money and this and that. So they had a long runway. But if someone is just really with their own money, it's so hard to understand and be disciplined to actually be on a course to build a brand, in a bigger company way. Let's say how AT&T would launch a product,
Right,
or
absolutely. Yeah.
How do you advise entrepreneurs can sort of discipline that themselves?
Well, let me give you another example, which I think is a great contrast to Can, right? So there's no doubt Can started off with lots of money. They've raised lots of money, and they're in it for the long run. So, in my opinion, their customer acquisition cost over the long term is going to be exorbitant.
Low.
But they've got a long-term strategy, and that's cool. Most cannabis companies can't afford that. So I'll give you another example. A few years back, Evergreen Herbal here in Washington State purchased a facility which had bottling lines. There were 3 bottling lines, and they hired me to come in and be their chief brand officer. The first issue that I dealt with was, we have 3 bottling lines. What should we create? And so I said, well, who are your customers? And they said, we're not quite sure. And I said, okay, let's take a look at who's in Washington State and who we can sell to. And so fast forward, what we did was we did some research. We found out very quickly that Washington State is bifurcated by the mountains. There's Eastern Washington and Western Washington. Western Washington is Seattle, and down the coast, it's very liberal. Eastern Washington, which is closer to Idaho and Montana, is less liberal, certainly. And so I started to look into that. And then some of the things that I saw very quickly was there was a high percentage of veterans suffering from PTSD in Eastern Washington. And so we started to dig into that a little bit more. And we went to the local veterans organizations and started to ask questions. And initially our thoughts were, they're Republican and they're not interested in cannabis. They're anti-cannabis. But what we came to find was that they weren't really Republican. They were libertarian, and they were okay with cannabis as long as they could use it discreetly. And so, we went to the VFW. We started to ask more questions. And as we started to interview the veterans that were suffering from PTSD, we realized they wanted to get off their meds. They were very interested in cannabis, but they didn't want to smoke it. So we talked to them about a cannabis-infused beverage, and they were interested. And we started to talk about what were beverages to them. And so, there was this hearkening back in nostalgia to cola, an American brand, if you will, from back in the day. And as these veterans started to think about this and share with this, what we ended up creating was a brand called Blaze American Cola. The tagline was, "The Cola Patriots Prefer." We launched it on the 4th of July. We did it in Spokane, Washington, at the VFW, where we worked with the veterans to promote this. And at the end of the day, or I should say at the end of 2 months, we were the #1 cannabis-infused beverage in Washington State. Why? Because we did very much like what Can is doing, but we found a community that needed some love and some care and some attention. And in this case, the veteran community with suffering from PTSD, looking to, swap out their medication for something different. We found them, and we drove, we created a product and we drove it to be #1 in Washington State. So it's different than Can. It's different than the celebrities. It's different than hey, we've got some serious backers and now we have deep pockets. It's more about who needs the product. How do we find them? How do we tailor a product to them? Again, the tagline, the name of the product, the color palette was red, white, blue. When we launched the product, all of those things really spoke to the community, and we were able to build a beverage.
And while you're gathering all these questions and all this data, I think you as a, because your job is to make sure the brand is perfect and brand definitions and everything is happening. How are you passing this as a company-wide SOP, let's say, that you want social media to adhere to these principles, you want sales reps to sort of buy into the philosophy of this? Like, how, are there any tips on, as a chief brand officer, now your job is to make sure everyone speaks and feels that brand, right, in a company?
Right.
How do you roll this out?
It's funny. I just got off a call earlier with the executive vice president of human resources from Jushi. They now have over 1,500 employees, that are working in multiple states at both their cultivations, their grows, as well as their retail stores, because they're vertically integrated. And that was exactly the question I just asked, of her, which is, you have so many different people in your organization at different places. How do you share this information? And some information might be valid in one state and not in another. For example, dosing. Dosing is different from state to state. So it takes a lot. It's sort of I guess a menu approach. But it's almost I know this is an old school term, but a Chinese menu approach where everything is valid on the menu, but you may take something over here or take something over there, and kind of choose it. So I think the answer, though, really is knowing who your audience or audiences are. So if you're able to basically dissect that and have, let's say, verticals. So you've got your internal employees, maybe that's even dissected into, you have your internal employees, but you also have your employees that touch customers, right? Which are a little different than the folks internally. And then as you start to build out those verticals of who it is you're speaking to, then you start to customize your message. The one thing that I always talk about is, as I say, too much actually, is meeting your consumers or customers where they are. And I always use this pool analogy. So if I'm going to have a pool party and I've got 10 friends that come over, and all 10 of those friends are really different in their swimming ability, but I want to get them into the pool, I need to talk to them differently. So, if one person says to me, hey, the pool's too shallow for me, I love diving, I would say, well, hey, let's go over to the deep end where the diving board is, and you can dive right into the deep end and you'll be safe. And then my other friend says, yeah, the pool is too deep for me, I'm not a great swimmer. Well, let's go over to the shallow end. I'll get you a life preserver. I'll help you. Or, the pool is too cold. The pool is this, or the pool is that. You know the story. But there's a response to each one of those 10 friends that I want to get into the pool. And the cannabis industry and cannabis consumers are very much the same thing. Even if they're going to try the same product at the end of the day, their reasons for trying the product, or their willingness to jump in or not to jump in, or to dip a toe in the pool before, those all need to be addressed, and you need to sort of speak to them and really focus on what their issues are.
Get it. One thing which we all suffer is to sort of measure branding play, right? Like, it's not like black and white sales where you knock on a door and then a dispensary gives you 5-case order. It's so hard to measure, brand overall, like just how blur as a branding, what is happening. What are some indicators that say that, hey, this company, you have no branding going on, and this company, I think you have some branding, inbound traffic coming purely because of branding, right? What are the things that you look for that can tell you a little bit, at least for entrepreneurs to just sort of measure this kind of things?
Right. Well, I mean, there's many different types of things. For example, engagement. So, and that could be anything from likes to conversations to all sorts of things online.
So you think engagement, if it's high on some brand, it's active, that means it's a good, it's to do with the brand? I thought it's more to do with the copy of what's going on in that post, let's say.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of things, right? So,
Okay.
and that engagement is only one thing. Here's what happens often with marketing in general, and this was something I dealt with when I was at Microsoft. I remember my boss once asking me, "So you're managing, radio and television and some of the other campaigns we're doing. Break it down for me. How's TV doing over radio, over this and that?" And I was like, I can't really tell you, because it's the effect of everything. If somebody sees a TV commercial and then they get into their car and they hear something on the radio, and they hear Microsoft again or Xbox again, and then they go home and they get online and their favorite influencer is talking about Xbox again. There's so many different ways to get hit and inundated with this. So many times, and I'm doing this right now with a cannabis company, they're about to kick off a bunch of programs. For example, they want to do LinkedIn, they want to do a couple of more organic programs, they want to hire an influencer, they want to do a geofencing program where they're going to have people text. And I've said to them, don't do it all at once. And they said, well, we're launching our product, we need to do it all at once. And I said, if you do it all at once, you won't know where you're getting traction, right? In some ways, it's like if you walk into a dark room with one candle, you can see the difference that one candle made in the dark room. If you walk in with the second candle, it's really hard to tell what a difference that second candle made. Then even more so with the third and the fourth and the fifth, right? Before you know it, you have a lit room, but you don't really know which candle is making the difference because they're all working in unison. So it's really important when you think about that, think about your things in terms of if you're going to launch something, launch it separately, launch it, see the traction. If there is traction, launch your next program, whatever that might be, but be methodical in that so you can actually see where the lift is. Otherwise, you won't know where it's coming from. So even more so, maybe even more importantly, instead of like, what are the metrics? Because the metrics could be many different things. I think the bigger picture is, how do you measure the metrics and how do you stop the muddying of the waters because you have too many metrics? Is probably a bigger issue, when I think about it. But I mean, the truth is, engagement is one thing where I started off, but brand recognition, and all of that either makes sense or doesn't make sense, depending on where the brand is.
You think taglines still make sense, like having a byline and taglines, or just playing with the name is better?
Wow, that's a great question.
I've noticed little less actions around taglines, especially for the new ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Yes, I think there are fewer taglines, although as I was putting together my presentation for the Cannabis Drinks Expo in Chicago, I pulled up the taste great, less filling, as I started to look for taglines that appeal to women or might appeal to different people for different reasons. But yeah, you're right.
But there would be the second biggest sales point, right? Like, I mean, your best salesperson is that the line below logo, I believe, as well, right? In all honesty, it's everywhere on a can, an actual product which you're selling, and it just says whatever. It evokes the emotion. That's the idea of the tagline.
Yes, and it really adds to. So, for example, when I was at American Express and MasterCard, I was there when we created "Don't Leave Home Without It" and "Priceless." And
Priceless was good, I think. Yeah. Emotional stuff was there as well.
Exactly. So I always remember the commercial of the dad bringing his daughter to the baseball game. And he bought her, the jersey and the hat.
But I think one of the point which you made here was the whole ad and the whole thing was done to sort of put tagline in minds of people. It was the tagline, actually. They were not selling MasterCard, they were selling Priceless.
Yes. And by the way, which brings me to something you just reminded me of. Do you remember the commercial, "Where's the Beef"?
Yeah.
Do you know most people remember the tagline and not the brand? So it's just interesting. And it's funny when I think about it, where's the beef is either Wendy's or Arby's, right? But most people don't remember, but they certainly remember where's the beef. Which brings the emotional component to it. And that's really important.
Cool. I think we'll just wrap it up with the last one, David. Just in a nutshell, if you had to give branding tips for all these entrepreneurs, just a little 5 to 6 points where they really, really need to pay attention, what would that be?
Yeah, start off with your consumer. Who's your consumer? And if you don't know who your consumer is, who do you want your consumer to be? That would be like the biggest advice I could give to anybody. In the cannabis space, I often joke that we create dad joke brands. Someone's stoned and they have a funny idea and they want to create a brand out of it. And I had somebody recently approach me for 421 Better Late Than Never. And they thought this was the best idea ever. And I thought, that's a t-shirt. It's Spencer's or Urban Outfitters, but it's not a brand, in my opinion. Because it doesn't speak to a specific customer or clientele or solve a problem or a need. And I think if you can get to the core of that, then you can start to, by solving problems and serving up solutions to a specific community, then you're just leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else, instead of just having another, novelty brand or dad joke for your brand.